Martin Luther King Jr., born Michael King Jr. January 15, 1929, was an American Baptist minister and activist, one of the most prominent leaders in the civil rights movement from 1955 until his assassination in 1968. An African-American church leader and a son of early civil rights activist and minister Martin Luther King Sr., King advanced civil rights for people of color in the United States through nonviolence and civil disobedience. Inspired by his Christian beliefs and the nonviolent activism of Mahatma Gandhi, he led targeted, nonviolent resistance against Jim Crow laws and other forms of discrimination. King participated in and led marches for the right to vote, desegregation, labor rights, and other civil rights. He oversaw the 1955 Montgomery bus boycott and later became the first president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. As president of the SCLC, he led the unsuccessful Albany movement in Albany, Georgia, and helped organize some of the nonviolent 1963 protests in Birmingham, Alabama. King was one of the leaders of the March 1963 on Washington, where he delivered his "I Have a Dream" speech on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. The civil rights movement achieved pivotal legislative gains in the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the Fair Housing Act of 1968. The SCLC put into practice the tactics of nonviolent protest with some success by strategically choosing the methods and places in which protests were carried out. There were several dramatic standoffs with segregationist authorities, who sometimes turned violent. Several times King would be jailed. Federal Bureau of Investigation FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover considered King a radical and made him an object of the FBI's COINTELPRO from 1963 forward. FBI agents investigated him for possible communist ties, spied on his personal life, and secretly recorded him. The FBI in 1964 mailed King a threatening anonymous letter, which he interpreted as an attempt to make him commit suicide. On October 14, 1964, King won the Nobel Peace Prize for combating racial inequality through nonviolent resistance. In 1965, he helped organize two of the three Selma to Montgomery marches. In his final years, he expanded his focus to include opposition towards poverty, capitalism, and the Vietnam War. In 1968, King was planning a national occupation of Washington, D.C. to be called the Poor People's Campaign. When he was assassinated on April 4 in Memphis, Tennessee, his death was followed by national mourning, as well as anger leading to riots in many U.S. cities. King was posthumously awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1977 and the Congressional Gold Medal in 2003. Martin Luther King Jr. Day was established as a holiday in cities and states throughout the United States beginning in 1971. The holiday was enacted at the federal level by legislation signed by President Ronald Reagan in 1986. Hundreds of streets in the U.S. have been renamed in his honor, and the most populous county in Washington state was rededicated for him. The Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. was dedicated in 2011. King was born Michael King Jr. on January 15, 1929 in Atlanta, Georgia, the second of three children to Michael King and Alberta King. King became friends with a white boy whose father owned a business across the street from his family's home. In September 1935, when the boys were about 6 years old, they started school. King had to attend a school for black children, Yonge Street Elementary School, while his close playmate went to a separate school for white children only. Soon afterwards, the parents of the white boy stopped allowing King to play with their son, stating to him, "We are white, and you are colored." When King relayed the happenings to his parents, they had a long discussion with him about the history of slavery and racism in America. Upon learning of the hatred, violence, and oppression that black people had faced in the U.S., King would later stated he was determined to hate every white people. His parents instructed him that it was his Christian duty to love everyone, King witnessed his father stand up against segregation and various forms of discrimination. Once, when stopped by a police officer who referred to King Sr. as boy, King's father responded sharply that King was a boy, but he was a man. When King's father took him into a shoe store in downtown Atlanta, the clerk told them they needed to sit in the back. King's father refused, stating, "We'll either buy shoes sitting here, or we won't buy any shoes at all." Before taking King and leaving the store, he told King afterward, "I don't care how long I have to live with this system, I will never accept it." In 1936, King's father led hundreds of African Americans in a civil rights march to the City Hall in Atlanta to protest voting rights discrimination. King later remarked that King Sr. was a real father to him. In September 1940, at the age of 11, King was enrolled at the Atlanta University Laboratory School for the 7th grade. While there, King took violin and piano lessons and showed keen interest in his history and English classes. In his adolescent years, he initially felt resentment against whites due to the racial humiliation that he, his family, and his neighbors often had to endure in the segregated South. In 1942, when King was 13 years old, he became the youngest assistant manager of a newspaper delivery station for the Atlanta Journal. That year, King skipped the 9th grade and was enrolled in Booker T. Washington High School, where he maintained a B+ average. The high school was the only one in the city for African American students. It had been formed after local black leaders, including King's grandfather Williams, urged the city government of Atlanta to create it. In high school, King became known for his public speaking ability. With a voice that had grown into an orotund baritone, he proceeded to join the school's debate team. King continued to be most drawn to history and English, and chose English and sociology to be his main subject while at school. King maintained an abundant vocabulary, but he relied on his sister, Christine, to help him with his spelling, while King assisted her with math. They studied in this manner routinely until Christine's graduation from high school. On April 13, 1944, in his junior year, King gave his first public speech during an oratorical contest sponsored by the Improved Benevolent and Protective Order of Elks of the World in Dublin, Georgia. In his speech he stated, "Black America still wears chains. The finest Negro is at the mercy of the meanest white man. Even winners of our highest honors face the class color bar." King was selected as the winner of the contest. On the ride home to Atlanta by bus, he and his teacher were ordered by the driver to stand so that white passengers could sit down. The driver of the bus called King a black son of a bitch. King initially refused, but complied after his teacher told him that he would be breaking the law if he did not follow the directions of the driver. As all the seats were occupied, he and his teacher were forced to stand on the rest of the drive back to Atlanta. Later, King wrote of the incident, saying, "That night will never leave my memory. It was the angriest I have ever been in my life." During King's junior year in high school, Morehouse College, an all-male historically black college that King's father and maternal grandfather had attended, began accepting high school juniors who passed the school's entrance examination. As World War II was underway, many black college students had been enlisted in the war, decreasing the numbers of students at Morehouse College. So, the university aimed to increase their student numbers by allowing junior high school students to apply. In 1944, at the age of 15, King passed the entrance examination and was enrolled at the university for the school season that autumn. In the summer before King started his freshman year at Morehouse, he boarded a train with his friend Emmett Weasel Proctor and a group of other Morehouse College students to work in Simsbury, Connecticut, at the tobacco farm of Coleman Brothers Tobacco, a cigar business. This was King's first trip outside of the segregated South into the integrated North. In a June 1944 letter to his father, King wrote about the differences that struck him between the two parts of the country. "On our way here, we saw some things I had never anticipated to see. After we passed Washington, there was no discrimination at all. The white people here are very nice. We go to any place we want to and sit anywhere we want to." The students worked at the farm to be able to provide for their educational costs at Morehouse College. as the farm had partnered with the college to allot their salaries towards the university's tuition, housing, and other fees. On weekdays, King and the other students worked in the fields, picking tobacco from 7 in the morning to 5 in the evening, and during temperatures above 100 degrees turned roughly $4 per day. On each Sunday, they would go to Hartford to attend church services at a church filled with white congregants. King wrote to his parents about the lack of segregation in Connecticut, relaying how he was amazed they could go to one of the finest restaurants in Hartford and that Negroes and whites go to the same church. In 1947, the 18-year-old King chose to enter the ministry. Throughout his time in college, King studied under the mentorship of its president, Baptist minister Benjamin Mays, who he would later credit with being his spiritual mentor. King had concluded that the church offered the most assuring way to answer an inner urge to serve humanity. King graduated from Morehouse with a Bachelor of Arts in Sociology in 1948. While studying at Boston University, he asked a friend from Atlanta named Mary Powell, who was a student at the New England Conservatory of Music, if she knew any nice Southern girls. Powell asked fellow student Coretta Scott if she was interested in meeting a Southern friend studying divinity. Scott was not interested in dating preachers, but eventually agreed to allow Martin to telephone her based on Powell's description and vouching. King married Coretta Scott on June 18, 1953 on the lawn of her parents' house in her hometown of Heiberger, Alabama. They became the parents of 4 children: Yolanda King, Martin Luther King III, Dexter Scott King, and Bernice King. During their marriage, King limited Coretta's role in the movement. In December 1959, after being based in Montgomery for 5 years, King announced his return to Atlanta at the request of the SCLC in Atlanta. King served until his death as co-pastor with his father at the Ebeneezer Baptist Church and helped expand the civil rights movement across the South. On March 29, 1968, King went to Memphis, Tennessee, in support of the black sanitary public works employees. Workers had been on strike since March 12 for higher wages and better treatment. In one incident, black street repairmen received pay for 2 hours when they were sent home because of bad weather, but white employees were paid for the full day. On April 3, King addressed a rally and delivered his "I've Been to the Mountaintop" address at Mason Temple, the world headquarters of the Church of God in Christ. King's flight to Memphis had been delayed by a bomb threat against his plane, the prophetic peroration of the last speech of his life. In reference to the bomb threat, King said the following: "And then I got to Memphis, and some began to say the threats, or talk about the threats that were out. What would happen to me from some of our sick white brothers?" King was booked in room 306 at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis. Ralph Abernathy, who was present at the assassination, testified to the United States House Select Committee on Assassinations that King and his entourage stayed at room 306 so often that it was known as the King Abernathy Suite. King was fatally shot by James Earl Ray at 4, 1968. As he stood on the motel's second-floor balcony, the bullet entered through his right cheek, smashing his jaw, then traveled down his spinal cord before lodging in his shoulder. Abernathy heard the shot from inside the motel room and ran to the balcony to find King on the floor. King died at Stedy Joseph's Hospital. King was initially interred in Southview Cemetery in South Atlanta, but in 1977 his remains were transferred to a tomb on the site of the MLK Junior National Historical Park. King's legacy includes influences on the Black consciousness movement and civil rights movement in South Africa. King's work was cited by and served as an inspiration for South African leader Albert Luthuli, who fought for racial justice in his country during apartheid and was later awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. King influenced Irish politician and activist John Hume. Hume, the former leader of the Social Democratic and Labour Party, cited King's legacy as quintessential to the Northern Irish civil rights movement and the signing of the Good Friday Agreement, calling him one of my great heroes of the century. King has become a national icon in the history of American liberalism and American progressivism. His main legacy was to secure progress on civil rights in the U.S. Just days after King's assassination, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1968. Title 8 of the Act, commonly known as the Fair Housing Act, prohibited discrimination in housing and housing-related transactions on the basis of race, religion, or national origin, later expanded to include sex, familial status, and disability. This legislation was seen as a tribute to King's struggle in his final years to combat residential discrimination in the U.S. The same year that Martin Luther King was assassinated, she established the King Center in Atlanta, Georgia, dedicated to preserving his legacy and the work of championing nonviolent conflict resolution and tolerance worldwide. Beginning in 1971, cities such as St. Louis, Missouri, and states established annual holidays to honor King. On January 17, 2000, for the first time, Martin Luther King Jr. Day was officially observed in all 50 U.S. states. Arizona 1992, New Hampshire 1999, and Utah in 2000 were the last 3 states to recognize the holiday. Out of the Mountain of Despair, a Stone of Hope, located in downtown Washington, D.C., the memorial honors Martin Luther King Jr.'s legacy and the struggle for freedom, equality, and justice, a prominent leader in the modern civil rights movement. Dr. King was a tireless advocate for racial equality, working class, and the oppressed around the world.